Hi class, how are you today? We are going to review chapter 12, probation, parole, and reentry. It's a very good chapter, has a lot of good information, and what I will try to do today is differentiate what we do in California as opposed to what other states do as far as probation, parole, and reentry or community corrections. So make sure you read the chapter. If you have any questions about what we're going to go over today, make sure you place it on the discussion board or send me an email. So community corrections basically allows convicted offenders to remain in the community under correctional supervision. There are conditions to the supervision that a person remains outside of jail or prison. Some of the community corrections sanctions can be probation, parole, home confinement, and electronic monitoring. So we're going to go over these. And again, basically community corrections involves everything where a person is not locked up. Okay, so it could be various types of treatment programs, counseling programs, halfway houses. Basically, you're not inside a jail or a prison. Okay. Probation is probably the most widely used community corrections sanction. And it is a sentence that is given by the court and it's served in the community. So if you're under probation supervision in California, you're going to be supervised by a county probation officer. The term probatio is the root word of probation, and it's a Latin term that means a period of proving or trial. And the founder of probation, which the book goes over, is John Augustus back in 1841 in Boston. He took selected offenders into his home as an alternative to imprisonment. I'm not sure what Mrs. Augustus thought about this, but it was very successful. He would take the person back into court after 6 or so months at his home, teaching them a skill and a vocational training program, and show the court that the person's been rehabilitated and can now go back into the community. So John Augustus, founder of probation, very famous person. And again, once probation started, which we'll get to in a little bit, it spread like wildfire across the United States. You don't need to necessarily know these dates, but by 1925, all 48 states had adopted probation legislation, and now every state has some sort of probation sanction. So the extent of probation, it is the most commonly used sentence in the United States, and it began with John Augustus in 1841. He housed mostly drunkards and petty thieves, but now probation can be used for violent offenders. Okay. There's a lot of statistics out there, and some statistics say that a bit more than half of the people that are discharged from probation successfully met their conditions of supervision. And not to say that they don't commit more crimes after, but during their supervision, after they discharge, they successfully met the conditions. So most people are compliant, slightly more than half, while under supervision of a probation officer. So there's conditions that you must follow when you're on probation. And some of you, when you graduate, will be going into probation departments and working as probation officers. So this is a good chapter for all of you folks. And I started out as in probation at Sacramento County Probation Department, and learned a lot there. So all the stuff is very relative to the job. So the conditions that you must follow on probation, there's two types. There's general conditions that apply to all probationers, which are you must report to your probation officer, you must not leave the county without permission. So there's basic general conditions that everybody must follow. Then there's specific or special conditions that may be mandated by the judge for an individual probationer, like no alcohol, no possession or consumption of alcohol, or curfews. So specific conditions or special conditions, the judge is going to order those. And a violation of any condition can lead to a revocation of probation and or a return to custody or sanction. So if you fail that curfew, or you are tested for drugs and there's drugs in your system, you are brought back before the court, before the judge, and the judge can revoke your probation and put you back in jail. So again, violating conditions are a very serious thing. You can read on federal probation and parole. It's very similar, but there's just some slight differences. It's just at a federal level. So if you're on federal probation or supervised release with the federal folks, you've committed a federal crime. And some of you will go into federal corrections, which is completely different from the state and the county. But you can read about that in your chapter. Okay, now we're going to switch to parole. Parole is from the French term meaning spoken or promise, and it's an early release of a prisoner prior to completion of their sentence. So parole is not a sentence, but it's an early release prior to completing a sentence. And we're going to go over the differences between probation and parole because they are completely different. They're like apples and oranges. If you know anybody out there that's a parole agent in California, or you may know a probation officer, so even the terms are different. So we're going to talk about these differences. So parole actually began prior to probation. And in Australia, Alexander McConaughey invented the mark system. And basically a prisoner who had enough good marks on their record while in prison could actually be let out early because of their good behavior. In 1842, Sir Walter Crofton in Ireland invented the tickets of leave in the prison system there. And that system basically let a person out for a leave, a period of leave, maybe a weekend or a week, and they actually went to work with the local village or farmers, and they were supervised by those people that employed them. And once these tickets of leave were satisfied and there was no problems or no issues, they were eventually released completely. So ticket of leave system began in Ireland. And then finally in 1876, Zebulon Brockway at Elmira Prison in New York started parole in the United States. So it's a long history, and most states have some sort of parole system as of today. So parole is a conditional release into the community following a prison term. It's not a sentence imposed by a judge, and the primary purpose is to gradually return offenders to lead productive lives. It's also, this bottom bullet says it may also act as a stimulus for making positive behavioral change. Basically, it's a carrot that is dangled in front of somebody. So if you want to get out of prison early, you have to behave well in prison. But then while you're out in the community, you still have to maintain yourself and behave. If not, we'll yank that carrot away and you go back to prison. So again, I wouldn't say it's a stimulus. It's more of a dangling a carrot in front of somebody. Two models of parole. We'll talk about those. There's discretionary parole. And in California, discretionary parole involves those that are sentenced to indeterminate sentence, a 25 years to life sentence or 15 years to life. Those people that are convicted of those crimes and serving those sentences go before the parole board or the board of parole hearings, and they will do an assessment and either grant an early parole or not. That's discretionary. It's discretionary on someone else. The other type is the mandatory parole. Basically, if you're serving a determinate sentence in California, 6 years, 3 years, 4 years, you will get out and you will automatically go on parole once you get out of prison. So the board has nothing to do with it because you're serving a determinate sentence. So those are the two models that we use in California, and most other states use those also. Some states have abolished discretionary release, so there is no discretion, okay? And other states use the other model where you serve a determinate sentence and you get out automatically. There is something called medical parole, and that's used for offenders who are deemed to be low risk and that have a serious medical condition and or they have less than 6 months to live. A lot of victims do not like that because when they were sentenced, they were supposed to serve their entire term, but yet now they're going to get out early. So there's some issues with medical parole, but it is increasing because of the population of prisons. Conditions of parole very similar to those of probation. There's general conditions and there's specific or special conditions. And we're going to look at some of those conditions in a little bit. And basically, employment is looked at as the catalyst to stop or to ensure that someone does not return to custody. So if you are employed and you're on parole, the likelihood of you returning or reoffending to criminal behavior is much lower. So employment seems to be the key. So if you're not employed, that's what the parole agent is supposed to do, is help you get a job, refer you places. So employment is a big deal with someone that's on parole. Okay, so these are some general conditions of parole for parolees in California. So this is from the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. And we'll just look at these briefly, but you need to look at each of these and read them and understand them. And put yourself as a parolee right now to see if you could actually do these things. You could say yes, sign on the bottom of the page and say, I will do all of these things. And again, these are just the general conditions. These are not your special conditions. So could you do all these things? So make sure you read those. And you're going to sign on the bottom. And if you violate any of these, you will go back for a sanction and possibly go back to prison. So there's a lot of stuff here. And I would say that a lot of my parolees, they failed to let me know that they got arrested or they received a citation or a ticket. That's probably the most thing that I found of these general conditions that were violated. Not too big of a deal. Okay, all you gotta do is be honest as a parolee, let your parole agent know what happened, and we can move on. So that was probably the most thing that occurred that I found. So anyway, read these, understand these, talks about knives and guns, obeying all laws, etc., etc. Okay, so now we're just real quickly going to go over probation and parole, the differences, okay, because they're very important, like apples and oranges. So here you got your parole agent on your right, and you have your probation officer on your left. So probation is a front-end sanction, okay, it comes on the front end of the criminal justice process, because you can be sentenced to probation, whereas parole is on the back end, because that happens after you leave prison. Next, probation is the judge's discretion. A judge sentences somebody to probation. A judge deems any sanctions to give the person during a revocation. But parole, the Board of Parole Hearings or the parole board has jurisdiction when there's a revocation or when there's an indeterminate sentenced inmate that wants to get out on parole. Probation is a sentence. Parole is an early release. Most terms of probation are 2 or 3 years. Most terms of parole are 3 years in California. So probation serves felons and misdemeanants. So you can be on probation for a misdemeanor or a felony. But in California, it's felons only. Because if you go to prison in California, it's for a felony, not a misdemeanor. And probation can entail jail or no jail time. Sometimes the judge will say 60 days in jail followed by 3 years probation, or just 3 years probation. As far as parole, you are released from prison and then you are supervised under parole supervision. So no jail when you're on parole. So make sure you understand these differences. Pretty simple. Okay, we'll move on here. Finally, the county runs probation in California, county probation officers, and then there's state parole agents, and the prisons are run by the state. And the difference is a county probation officer is an officer of the court, and a state parole agent is an agent of the state. So again, a lot of differences here. So some advantages of probation and parole: it's very low cost other than housing somebody in jail or prison. It increases the employment for the person that is on the street in the community. The person can then provide restitution. There's a lot of community support for parole and probation. There's a reduced risk of criminal socialization that's in jail or prison because the person's out in the community where most people are not committing crimes. The increased use of community services is huge. There's counseling, there's reunification, there's all sorts of programs out there to serve these parolees and probationers. And there's such an increased opportunity for rehabilitation in the community as opposed to in jail or prison. Many more programs available, which is a very positive thing. There's probably a waiting list at most prisons for basic programs such as AA or NA or anger management. Some disadvantages: a lot of people look at probation as just a slap on the wrist, and it's not really punishment. There is an increased risk to the community because the person is in the community and there's no magic ball that's going to say this person will or will not commit another crime. The social costs can be increased, and there may be some discriminatory or unequal effects on people. And one of the discriminatory issues comes with electronic monitoring, where some people, if you do not have a home to go to plug in your electronic monitoring device, that will discriminate against you. So if you're a homeless person and you're getting out of jail on electronic monitoring, but you have nowhere to plug in your monitor every night, then you can't be on electronic monitoring. So there may be some discriminatory issues that go on with some of these types of programs. The legal environment, again, this is the book talking. About 26% of adults are on parole and 28% of those on probation have conditional releases revoked. So that says about a quarter of the people have their probation revoked. Most common reasons for a revocation are technical violations, not very many criminal acts. So technical violations can be failure to report, failure to participate in a required treatment program, moving without permission, not notifying your parole agent of a contact with police or an arrest. So a lot of the revocations come from technical violations, not criminal acts. Of course, there are other criminal acts that a person can do, as being intoxicated or having drugs in their system, etc., etc. You can read about the United States Supreme Court decisions which affect parolees and probationers. There's a couple things that you need to know about the revocation process and where that came from. You need to check on Morrissey versus Brewer to make sure you understand the revocation process and how that works. And as finally we come to the job or jobs employment of probation and parole officers. So their primary duties, and they work in the prisons and they work out of the prisons, and they work in the jails and they work out of the jails. So they conduct intake procedures or processes, and what they do is they do a diagnostic and needs assessment to figure out what level of supervision these folks are going to be on once they get out. And they supervise the clients or the persons that are on parole and probation. And they also write pre-sentence investigation reports. Those are in the court units. So some of you, when you graduate, you'll be working for a county probation department, and you'll go to the court unit and start writing pre-sentence investigation reports. It's kind of fun, but you have to be very objective when you write those. Basically what that does is helps a judge sentence somebody after a conviction. So that's some of the primary duties which occur. I like to call it the two-hat theory. And basically, you're a social worker and you're a cop. So you're going to help the parolee and probationer. You're going to refer them to jobs and to vocational training. You're going to help them make it on the street, as well as at any time, you're going to place them in custody, put handcuffs on them, take them down to jail, and book them back in. So you have two hats to wear. So you're going to be their advocate, and you're also going to be the cop. There are large caseloads. A county probation officer will maybe have 200 or 300 or 400 people on their caseload. Impossible to see everyone, so therefore a lot of caseloads are banked, where that means that the probationer will just send a form in once a month to ensure that they're complying with their conditions. I don't know about a lack of career mobility. I don't think that's correct, because you can start as a probation assistant in Sacramento County and work your way up to the chief of probation of the county if you want. I started out at the county and worked my way up, and then I went into parole with the state and worked my way up. So there's a lot of mobility, I think, in the probation and parole fields. There is stress because you're going to work a lot of hours. There may be some tense moments. You may have to do a lot of studying to get through the academies, but like any other job, it has its benefits also. And in my time as a parole agent, I always talked about the two types of parole agents there are. The first type of parole agent counts how many parolees they put back into custody. And the other type of parole agent is the parole agent that counts how many parolees they discharged off of parole. So you need to decide which parole agent you want to be. Intermediate sanctions, we talked about those briefly at the beginning. An intermediate sanction is anything short of being incarcerated. So there's split sentencing, where you sentence somebody to a short time in jail along with probation. There's shock probation and parole, again, which is a short period in custody followed by probation and parole. There's mixed sentencing, which involves community service. So again, it depends on the crime, depends on the attitude, and it depends on what the person has going for them in the community. If they have a good family support structure that's out there, they have a home to go to, they have employment, then their community service is going to be much greater. And there is also intensive probation supervision, or IPS, and it's basically seeing somebody 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times a week at their home, at their job, randomly drug testing them 2, 3, or 4 times a week. Basically, these are very violent offenders that need intensive supervision. And then finally, there's home confinement and remote location monitoring. Again, there's some discriminatory issues there because not everybody has a home to go to. The future of probation and parole. The book talks about the criticism of parole. It unfairly reduces prison sentences. There's no assurance that the parolee will not commit crimes. There's a failure of parole to curb recidivism, or the revolving door theory. Parole violators account for over half of prison admissions, and it's linked to concerns about reintegration. Well, that's all good and everything, but the longer our prisons are overcrowded, the more probation and parole is going to be used. And probation and parole works for some, but not for all, as we know. And you cannot predict the behavior of somebody. All you can do as a probation officer or parole agent is supervise, counsel, and ensure the person does what they're supposed to do. So I think that probation and parole is going to be going up as far as employment because of our overcrowding of the prisons. Okay, that is chapter 12, great chapter. Make sure you email me with any questions or place them on the discussion board. And hope you have a great day, and we will talk to you again soon. Thank you.